Hello, my fellow kin. Welcome back to the channel and welcome to another competitive list review. Now, I do want to just say that I think it's pretty funny that we went all of Pariah Nexus without getting any event showings at all for Votann, which was pretty depressing. And then all of a sudden, starting with the Vietnam event piloted by Dan Tran, and then proceeding into North America and then going back to Europe, we're getting quite a few dubs that are coming through here for the Leagues of Votann, which is pretty cool. I think it's a great time to be playing the faction. I know a lot of people were getting a little discouraged, but it looks like we still have some tricks up our sleeves, and we'll be looking at one of those tricks in today's video with a very new archetype that I've never seen before and haven't reviewed yet on the channel. But before we go any further, I just want to give a quick shout out to our channel members, which is blowing my mind how quickly it's growing and how many people are actually becoming channel members. I just really am humbly thanking you for your incredible support. It really means a lot. It's taken me by surprise, the amount of positivity and the amount of thanks and the amount of just overall support I've been getting. Absolutely incredible, and I really didn't expect it, so thank you guys so much. It really does mean a lot. So if you're interested in becoming a channel member, you could check it out using the link down in the description below. And for any of you that have become channel members, please reach out to me on the Discord so I could promote you there to the legendary Hearthguard status. Now with that said, let's jump into the video. So on today's agenda, we'll be taking a look at the Hanseatic Alliance Open 2024 held on the weekend of October 4th to the 6th of this year. As always, we'll look at the Votann placing, the matchups, the overall score and performance. We'll do a deep dive list analysis, discuss some strengths and weaknesses, and of course contextualize the results of the placings by looking at some of the matchups. Now for this Hanseatic Alliance Open event, the list we're analyzing today came first place out of 190 players, piloted by Tim Schneider, taking home an 8-win, 0-draw, 0-loss placing. Absolutely phenomenal. The matchups included actually some really tough ones. So we have the first game is Votann versus Tau, 16-4. Votann 20-0 against another Votann mirror matchup. Votann at 14 versus Death Guard at 6. Votann at 16 versus Chaos Knights at 4. Votann 11 to Space Marine Black Templars at 9. So a very tight game here. Votann 20-0 against Orcs. And another very close game of Votann 11-9 against Sisters. And then wrapping the event up, we have Votann at 13 to Thousand Suns at 7. For those of you unfamiliar, this is WTC scoring. Now, as for the list itself, actually quite interesting. I don't think we've seen something like this before. I want to say that just looking at this, there's a couple things that might jump out to you, namely the two giant squads of Chthonian Berserks. And I think it's just really funny that this has been a very prominent trend in some of those top winning and top placing Votann lists recently. So this is something that hasn't really been explored all that much before in the past. It did make an appearance in one or two lists that we covered, but now seeing two large squads of 10-man Berserks and just completely omitting Hearthguard altogether, I think is something worth discussing and something worth reviewing. So kicking the list off without getting too ahead of ourselves, we have two characters, one being an Ioneer champion running the enhancement Grim Demeanor. Now, right out the gate, interesting loadout choice here. We're running the Dark Star Axe instead of running the Mass Hammer. So I think the Dark Star Axe is an interesting choice here. Now, historically, when we do see an Ioneer champion taken solo, they usually run around with the Mass Hammer. And the Mass Hammer is nice because it fits a really niche role inside of our list, which is having access to really high damage in melee. We don't really have good consistent damage, so with the E-Champ it helps kind of leverage that a bit, and it fills the role of like a 5-man Berserk squad. Now I think in this case, when we're running the Dark Star Axe, it really comes down to what we're missing in our list, and we do have with these two large bricks of Berserks, which we'll talk about in a little bit, a ton of higher strength damage. And I think because of that, it's a little bit too redundant to include an E-Champ with the Mass Hammer when we probably are looking for something that's just efficient enough to deal with any low wound count, medium model count unit that comes pushed towards our DZ. We are also running, as I mentioned, the Grim Demeanor enhancement, which I do think is an interesting choice. I personally would have expected to see either Appraising Glare taken on this character instead, or the Wayfarer's Grace, which would allow him to get back up on a 2+, just acting as a double activation unit throughout the course of the game. Maybe it just came down to points ultimately, but I can kind of see an argument for taking Grim Demeanor on something like this, because with the Darkstar Axe and the number of attacks you have, you do want to make sure that everything connects as efficiently as possible. And so if you can negate something like Armor of Contempt, which might go on like a Scout Squad, for example, it probably helps ensure that you get all your damage through to pick up the unit. The next character we have is a Brokier Iron Master. Now this is the character that's running Appraising Glare. I think it's an interesting choice. I personally tend to favor running the solo E-Champ as my solo character because I just feel like the damage they provide and just the overall toughness and durability of the unit is sufficient for my needs. They're also quite cheap, but I can understand for a small, tiny price increase taking an Iron Master with Appraising Glare instead. It's been discussed in our Discord server, which you could join free of charge using the link down in the description below. And I do think it could work in an archetype like this where we're running at least 2 land fortresses and probably at least 2 Sagittars as well. So we are fairly heavily mechanized, maybe not in terms of model count, but definitely in terms of points, coming in at 225 for each land fort and of course 115 for each of the 3 Sagittars. So we do get some added value by having this guy kind of hide behind some obscuring terrain, be inside of ruins, just hovering close to where we're pushing or where we're staging with our castle of land fortresses, and just helping to ensure that because we have so few activations, they do last as long as possible on the table. So an interesting choice. Next up, we have our standard 2x10 Hearthkin Warriors, who are going to be splitting up, of course, inside of Sagittars, keeping 1 on the table on our home field objective. In terms of loadouts, nothing too crazy here. We have a standard high-las rifle and rotary cannon. Doesn't really matter all that much what you pick here. Now, this is where things get a little bit interesting. We're running 2 squads of Berserks, 10-man units each, with the mauls and the grenade launchers. I think this is an interesting choice for a couple of reasons. Now, firstly, the Berserks are a very solid unit. They're a good trading piece, they're a good utility piece. They basically act as another warrior squad that does a little bit more. They could do actions for you. They're surprisingly resistant with their 5-up Feel No Pain despite only having a 6-up base save. So I do think when you run a squad of 10, you do get a little bit more added value out of the unit because it just becomes all that much more difficult for your opponent to get through them. I think that's an overall theme with the list that we're looking at today. It's that we're opting for these durable staying pieces without going for the Iron Hearthguard. So how can we have that board presence without necessarily paying the premium for those 10-man bricks? And I think the Berserks offer a good option to that. We've seen them make appearances in other lists as well. Running inside of land fortresses, it offers you a good trading piece that is surprisingly annoying to shift when you are reducing that incoming damage, the probability of dying, simply because you're at this weird breakpoint with a 5+ Feel No Pain, where you can effectively reduce damage 2 attacks at 2 wounds each and make people less efficient at killing you. And in terms of the loadouts here, we're running mauls on each one of these. The mauls are statistically the better weapon option. I think they have a lot more play into different units. They could punch up. And in this list, that's what we really are going for here. We're going for that ability to trade up because we have so few activations. But I do think it would be interesting to see a 5-man unit included here with axes. This would give you even more flexibility, kind of like a Swiss Army knife of Chthonian Berserks, if you would, that would allow you to kind of pick and choose which unit you need to throw away first. But of course, we have a limitation with our points values, so that probably doesn't fit anyway. Nonetheless, a very interesting inclusion having 2 of these. Riding inside of the land fortresses, it means you do get to take advantage of that transport capacity. You do get to make sure you get that extra movement disembarking and going for a charge. And you could play center or flanks depending on what you need done. Next up, we have a standard inclusion of 10 Jaegers, taking a loadout with the APM, the sniper, and then everybody else having pistols and knives. A very solid unit. We all know this. We've all experienced it before in our games. Very powerful at either getting you access to your early CP through killing one of the judged targets, or for ensuring that you stage or deny your opponent the ability to early stage with infiltrators as well. So good utility here, solid piece. We then go into the ranged damage dealers, and these are 2 squads of 6 pioneers. Now, larger squads of pioneers have also been making a more significant presence on the table, I would say, if we look at some of those top performing lists in Pariah Nexus more recently. And it makes a lot of sense. They're comparable to the Hearthguard. They have AP on their weapons, which is massive, and they're just significantly quicker and faster. They go up and down, they could reposition, they could screen more effectively. When you commit them somewhere, that's not necessarily where they're dying if you play them smart. It's a much more difficult unit to play, I think, in my opinion, but it does have its merits, and we have seen this as a result take a lot of Votann lists to higher tables. Shifting over to our vehicles, this is where things get a little bit more mechanized. We have 2 Hecaton land fortresses. Love the Hecaton land fortress. We are also seeing a trend of people taking more of these in their lists. They're solid units at 225. They're very well costed. They have a decent transport capacity. They have decent guns, and they have really good staying power, being toughness 12, 16 wounds with a 2-up base save, access to cover, access to armor contempt. They're very durable and difficult to shift, which means that they're also pretty good at transporting our berserks, who are not so glass cannon anymore trading piece, that are very annoying to deal with, and just getting them somewhere reliably. Lastly, we have the inclusion of 3 Sagittars. This is more speed, it's more board presence on the table. We get our warriors there early. They could do actions for us. We could throw them onto objectives to contest primary or to take primary for ourselves. So I think that this is much needed in a list design where we're focusing so heavily on damage and on primary. I think having 3 of the Sagittars is really nice with so few activations, because it just means we could get to different places on the table and we could achieve more of our secondary objectives. So overall, I think it's a pretty powerful list. You have strong melee presence, which is something Votann generally lacks. I'd say even when you do include the Hearthguard squad, let's just look at a 5-man unit, for example, and you do take the E-Champ with them. Most of the time, it's the E-Champ who does all the damage. The problem with the Hearthguard in melee is that, yes, they have strength 9 weapons, it's AP2, it's 2 damage flat, they even have a 3 damage weapon. On paper, it's great. The problem is that it's kind of unreliable because we don't have access to any rerolls in melee. That means that, yes, you are hitting on 2s if they're judged, but what probably will end up happening is that you're going to drop some of the dice, you're going to drop some of the wounds, and then you won't really do all that much damage when there's only so few attacks that are included with the unit. The Berserks make up for this, having significantly more attacks, and taking a 10-man brick means that you're actually getting access to 32 strength 9 attacks. So this is pretty powerful, I would say. At damage 3, could wipe Terminators off the table, could wipe tanks off the table. It's basically a unit you throw forward. If your opponent overwatches them, probably they will not get through everything, especially with the Feel No Pain. And that means that more reliably you'll be able to connect and have that extra damage, that redundancy to be able to push through and kill your target. So they will always be able to do the job that you need them to commit to in a game. And I think that's really strong, having a reliable piece. They are only going to be hitting on 3s, which a little bit unfortunate, but you have access to strats which help boost their efficiency, such as Warrior's Pride, which would increase the AP of your target based on the number of tokens that they have. And I do think this comes into play a lot. I think it's very powerful as well, as we'll see later on in some of the matchups. So on that note, it does have good staying power despite being a fairly elite list where our units are kind of composed of much larger sizes. I still think that access to just a bunch of wounds on our Berserk unit, despite being with a 6-up base save, is still quite powerful, right? That's effectively a 22 wound unit that you're throwing, times 2 in your list. You have access to the 2 land forts as well, the warriors, the Sagittars, so you do have that redundancy, you do have that ability to kind of just stick on the board inside of places that you need to at critical times. And on that note, I think you have very favorable trades that could be accomplished with this list because you can so reliably pick up whatever you set out to kill, and I think that that means you'll have a good time controlling primary as well. It's also a very unique build, which means that not a lot of people are going to know how to play around this. And, I'm a Votann player looking at this, and my first impression was, whoa, I've never seen this before. I wonder how this works. And I think a lot of other people would probably feel that way as well when they see that there's 20 Berserks at the table. So pretty cool. I think it's a very unique design. Now, that said, with all the strengths, I do think there are some weaknesses. The first one I identified, which is again more of a question, is how does this list do with secondaries? What kind of secondary potential do we think we're dealing with here? Because we do have very expensive units in the list, and that's always one of the drawbacks with elite builds, is that we have fewer things that could go away and just stay out of the fight for a couple of turns to do an action, or be out of position for a little bit longer. This could potentially be problematic. It doesn't look like it really came up in the games here, as most of them, as we might expect, into some of the tougher matchups are very close ones, versus into some of the more favorable matchups are absolutely dominated. So it doesn't appear to have caused an impact in any of the games just looking at the raw numbers, but I would be curious to hear from the pilot and see how he thinks he fared. Again, on that note, we do have fewer activations as well, which means we have to naturally be a little bit more careful with where we're putting our units and what we're doing with them. The last point here I put is a question, and again, while there is some durability built into the land fortresses and just having 22 wounds to chew through for each berserk squad, and of course having large bike squads as well, I can't help but feel that it's still overall very fragile. Our bikes are only saving on 4s, our berserks are only saving on 6s, and feel no pains could sometimes only get you so far. So I do wonder how the pilot felt and how he navigated his games keeping this fragility in mind. What do you guys think about this? Did I miss anything? Let me know in the comments below. So overall, a super interesting list. I'd be curious to try this out myself. It looks quite fun. Unfortunately, I don't have access to 20 berserkers. I only have 10, but if any of you guys do, definitely try this one out. Give it a shot and let me know what you think. So that's the list. I think a super interesting design here. I think a lot of thought went into it to kind of devise something unique and new. And a huge congratulations, of course, to Tim Schneider for such an incredible placing and skill capability for piloting this list at the event. All right, so let's take a quick moment and talk about some of the matchups. We're going to look at 3 games today, as this was an 8-game event, and I don't want to make this a 3-hour video, so I'll just pick 3 that were really interesting to me, and we'll talk a little bit about these and see how these games might have gone down. The first game I want to look at is Game 1 into Tau. Now, this was a 16-4 victory for Votann here, and I thought that this one was interesting because Tau is generally a matchup that I do think Votann have a harder time playing into. It's typically a gunfight, and if you really think about it, Tau are basically playing the same game Votann are playing, except they have a codex, so they have better tools to do it. Anything that we do for shooting, they could do a little bit better. Anything we could do for board presence, they could do a little bit better as well. So I think that it's a tight game, and I think that when you are playing this, as we discussed in the Discord, you're really trying to go for like a 10-10 or 11-9 victory here, and just try to play as even as possible and try to edge out a win just through skill or capitalizing on mistakes that your opponents make. I do think it's interesting anyway, looking in the context of this list in particular, because I was curious to see how the Berserks would fare in this matchup, and I actually think that they're probably the MVPs. So the Talus of this event was running Montka, it had Dark Strider, a couple Cadres, a couple Breacher teams, Pathfinders, Stealth Suits, Vespids, 2 Broadsides, a Hammerhead, 3 Piranhas, and 3 Riptides. So actually quite heavy onto the utility side and a little bit less on the damage dealing. And I think this was probably to Votann's favor. There really isn't anything in this list outside of the Breacher teams that would pose a big threat to what our win condition is. And our win condition here, I think in this matchup, is having the Berserks just cause mayhem. I think this would solidify your ability to win the game because there really isn't anything else that could kill them. You have quality shots on the broadsides, quality shots on the hammerheads, good utility and movement blocking potential with the piranhas, but even if you expose your berserks to try to deal with something like this, the riptides aren't going to be able to pick up the full squad. This means that you have a significant advantage here because you have a lot of things in your list that your opponent just cannot deal with if you are able to bait out the breachers and eliminate them early on. So what probably ended up happening here was using our Sagittars early in the game to stage effectively, and then from there, deciding how we want to trade our units. Are we going to try to throw out the Berserks first and in turn bait out the Breacher teams, or do we use the bikes instead to initiate this trade? Because if the bikes come out, the Riptides will pick them up without issue, so we want to make sure that we're getting as much value as we can out of our units. This means, in my opinion, probably holding the bikes back a little bit longer here, and then using them to try to pick up something on the sides, like the Stealth Suits, for example, or screening the Vespids who are going to come down, if I think they have their new rules by this point, come down and try to do some kind of secondary action. So again, I really think that this game came down to a little bit of a mismatch in terms of list design for the Tau player playing into something that is actually going to go damage heavy and board presence heavy with just 22 wound models. It's tough to deal with, and the only thing in this list that I'm seeing here that would have any chance of holding the line against the Berserks would be the Breachers. So ultimately, I think this really did contribute to Votann's significant lead over the Tau player in this game, just lacking the tools to deal with the threats. And of course, well done to Tim Schneider, who presumably identified that early on and played the game accordingly. Now, the next game I want to talk about here are Chaos Knights. Looking at this list on paper, you might be inclined to tell yourself that you do not have the anti-tank to be able to reliably pick up Knight models every turn. Because when you're playing against Knights, you're trying to pick up as many Knights as you can before you get tabled. So I think it's interesting here that the Berserks are probably the MVP when we think about it, because not only can they pop whatever they touch in melee, being strength 9, especially if it's double judged, but on top of that, the Knight player simply does not have the volume of fire to interact with this unit. So once again, I think that this is a mismatch in terms of what the Knight list has available for tools and what the Votann player brought in to absolutely neuter any chance of the opponent destroying them. And this makes sense when we look at what the list composition was. We have a bunch of War Dogs. We have War Dog Stalkers, War Dog Brigands, War Dog Huntsman, Carnivore. Nothing here is really strong enough to be able to pick up these frontline units that are going to be in your opponent's face. And that means the rest of your army, which is in danger to some of those Melta shots, can sit back a little bit more defensively and pick things up from afar. This means that depending on how the game goes down, you'll probably be in a better position to control the midboard, to control those side objectives once your opponent does a push and you counter and start advancing forward with your line of Berserkers. I actually really do think this is how the game went down. I struggle to see a world where the Knight army, just 2 Knights on one side of the table, will be able to pick up 10 Berserks because they simply don't have the volume of fire. It's quality shots, it's quality melee, but the volume isn't there. I think it's just like a really funny phenomenon to see where something as innocent as the Berserk unit can actually pose as this super annoying threat for your opponent to have to play around. I'd love to hear a little bit more, of course, about what you guys think, and if the pilot does watch this video, Tim Schneider, please let us know down in the comments section below how this game went for you. The next game I want to talk a little bit about is Game 7 into Sisters. For me personally, a very difficult matchup because I think Sisters are absolutely cracked with the Miracle Dice and the influx of Miracle Dice they receive. They have so many tricks and so many tools that just, it feels like you're playing a different game when you compare it to how straightforward Votann are. It really does. It's funny. But anyway, in the context of this event and the list the Votann player was running, I think it is still interesting that they managed to get a win here, but one that is so narrow and close. Now, is this because Sisters have access to incredible Overwatch potential with their Flamers or their ability to change dice to be 6s? Potentially. We do know that, if you do poke a vehicle out, the Sister, if they get into Melta range, will reliably be able to pick that up. It also means that they're significantly more resistant to some of your attacks as well with access to Miracle Dice that'll reduce that incoming damage by automatically passing their saves if they need to. This means it can negate some of our incoming damage because the Berserks, again, without access to rerolls, are still quite swingy, hitting on 3s and usually wounding on 3s or 4s. But against some of these sister bodies, for example, being toughness 3, it does make things a little bit easier for you to connect. I do wonder in this case how one squad of 10 with axes would have fared versus having 2 squads with the hammers. Because you do get access to a sweep profile, which I think absolutely negates anything that a Sisters player could do in terms of reducing your ability to do damage to them by auto-passing saves, for example, just with the sheer volume of attacks that you have. Then again, perhaps you don't actually need that many attacks when you're running a 10-man unit with the axes, so potentially maybe just running a smaller 5-man with plasma axes instead. Maybe that's kind of the direction I would be curious to see this list go into, is just maybe teching a little bit more into having some different tools for different jobs. So sometimes all you really need is a hammer, or in this case, 20 of them. Now, looking at the list, we're running Junith Eruthia, who I haven't actually seen before. We have Morven Val, Triumph of St. Catherine, We have 3 Immolators, Arcoflagons, Castigators. We have Dominion squads, Paragon War Suits, Retributor squads, Seraphim squads, and Novitiates. So I think one of the big benefits with the list design we have here, in this case, would be the large squads of bikes as well. This means you are able to, if you need to expose yourself and get shot to Overwatch or shot in return, it does mean that you have enough wounds to survive. And because your opponent is toughness 3, you are able to pick them up pretty reliably, especially these smaller squads with the large bike units. So again, I think that this is favorable here, just having extra resilience built into each unit by increasing the amount of models in that unit, the unit size, the squad. So this is particularly helpful, of course, for the Berserks, who 10-man bricks are going to be pretty resistant to flamers. They're going to be pretty resistant to Overwatch, and I think would make exceptional units trying to pop the Paragon War Suits and bring down Morven Val as well. It also means you can play a little bit more aggressively with them because you're not necessarily afraid of getting Overwatched. And with the Land Fortresses, you play a little bit more defensive here. Maybe you stage around central ruins so that your Berserks have access to either flanks. As things dissipate off the table and get whittled down, you can of course pick up your bikes who might be screening in the back end to make sure that the Seraphims don't land there, pick them up, bring them somewhere else, and try to wipe out a flank or a side objective as well. So again, I do think that the list is very maneuverable, surprisingly, for having so few units inside, and you really get to capitalize on board presence through that flexibility with the bikes, these 2 large squads who have exceptionally large footprints going up and down. You also have access to the transports that are going to be launching your units out onto the battlefield to either do secondaries for you in obscure corners or to be able to push forward onto objectives or just stall your opponent and get them off of their primary instead. So again, I really think this comes down to a really solid list design. And again, Sisters are a very difficult matchup for Votann. So the fact that this was an 11-9, I think it goes a long way in showing that the skill of the pilot is also very important when we're talking about the list's results at events. So let's try something a little bit different in this week's video. I picked a list out here that I thought was also quite interesting. This is the Space Marine Black Templar list that's running Gladius Task Force. We have Chaplain Grimaldus, we have Primaris Crusader squads, Assault Intercessors with jump packs, and a bunch of tanks. We have Gladiator Reapers, we have Destructor Predators, we have Vindicators, and of course we have a Scout Squad for secondaries. So my question to you guys is, how do you think this game went down? The end result was a very close 11-9 as well, just like what we saw with the Sisters. What do you guys think were some of the advantages for the Votann player in this matchup? What do you think were some of the difficulties? And how do you think some of these units performed? How do you think this game went down? Let me know in the comments below. Alright guys, with that said, another big congratulations to Tim Schneider for coming first place out of 190 players with Votann. An 8-0 victory is absolutely massive, super impressive, especially with this faction. So well done, and of course well done for creating such an interesting list that made me have to make a video and talk about it. As always, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed this week's video, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment for me down below. As always, a massive thank you to the channel members who help support the channel, and of course to our Discord users. And you could join the Discord free of charge, of course, using the link down in the description below, where you could talk tactics, share photos of your models, get them featured in my weekly videos, and just discuss all things Votann related. So once again, thanks so much for tuning in, and I'll catch you in the next one.